Good evening, everyone. Today, we saw it. American police officers with nightsticks and shields forcefully shut down a public demonstration. It happened in Chicago. Several people were hurt, a few dozen arrested, and the prediction of possible violence around the NATO summit came true. Protest marches early in the day were loud but uneventful, and then it happened. Something or somebody made all hell break loose. Watch. Chicago police say the crowd was about 2,500 strong when the tension escalated. It happened not far from where President Obama and more than 50 world leaders were juggling issues facing Afghanistan and NATO. The city's top police officer blames a small group of troublemakers.
That there was a group of what we commonly refer to as the black bloc folks who kind of rallied together. They put their masks on, and we had intelligence from the crowd that as soon as the ceremony with the soldiers were over, that they were going to charge the stage and try and break through and assault our cops. That's exactly what happened. They rallied, they charged the cops, and they assaulted the officers. We responded. So far today, we're up to 45 arrests today.
And tonight's CNN's Paul Verkammen is live down there in the crowd, or where the crowd was earlier. Paul, you were right in the middle of all that when it got violent. What happened out there today? Who did what to trigger this mess?
Don, when you're looking at that from the inside out, it's very difficult to determine if there was one flashpoint. As the superintendent said, he believed that the black bloc protesters were going to charge the stage. That's when it became clear that there were just way too many people in one small space, many of them trying to go in different directions. Don't forget the organizers of the vets who had thrown their medals in symbolic disgust over the wars across the seas. They were walking west, and everything just broke loose at one point, so it's hard to say exactly why or what's going on. But I should note, as you can hear the sirens behind me, there are still groups walking through the streets of Chicago right now. You can see below me, there are police with their visors up and their riot helmets on. Every single one of them worried, because this has gone on now for 2 nights, that the group of demonstrators will go into their area, try to cross the Chicago River here, or whatever it may be. Now back to today's protest. I pressed the superintendent of police and I asked him if force was necessary and why did they use their batons.
Can you explain why officers use their batons?
Absolutely. To overcome an assault? Absolutely.
You said you were concerned about the image, but ultimately the batons did come out, and it's not a pretty thing when the batons come out.
No, but ultimately the officers were assaulted. They don't have to stand there and take an assault.
And the chief also said that he had been verbally assaulted, not that that would trigger any sort of a skirmish, but I have to tell you, there were clearly protesters who were pushing the officers first, and they have been enduring unimaginable taunts, Don, repeated taunts, with guys getting in their face, swearing at them and calling them all sorts of names. So it has been tense, and I think when they characterize it as the black bloc versus police, that might be an accurate depiction, because I didn't see, for example, anybody who might be under the umbrella of an anti-war demonstrator waving a peace sign, getting in the officer's face, and them getting jostled by the officers.
All right, Paul Verkammen for us tonight in Chicago. Paul, thank you so much for your reporting. And while Chicago police and demonstrators fought outside, one word dominated the discussion inside the summit, and it was Afghanistan. One key moment today, the president of France announced he would pull his 3,300 combat troops out of Afghanistan by the end of this year. CNN's Jessica Yellen has more on that.
Before the summit even kicked off, I'll tell you, Afghanistan is dominating this meeting, and it's so important that before the summit began, the president sat down with Afghan President Hamid Karzai. And in public remarks, Karzai, the Afghan president, thanked the U.S. taxpayers for everything the taxpayers have done for Afghanistan, said that the Afghans will no longer soon be a burden to the U.S., and assured the president that Afghans will be ready to take over the combat lead when it's handed over.
Jessica Yellen reporting in Chicago today. And also today, NATO leaders signed a deal to add 5 more unarmed drones to the alliance. More than a dozen countries will pitch in to pay for them. Today in Chicago, it was a scene we looked at right here that we were hoping not to see around the NATO summit. Unbelievable. Protesters who had been marching peacefully and police officers closely watching for trouble, suddenly they started fighting. Well, Chicago's police superintendent says his cops were in the right, that they were reacting correctly to an assault by protesters. A few demonstrators and police officers were hurt, and more than 40 people were arrested. CNN's Ted Rowlands was right in the middle of it.
A small group of protesters was all that was left after a chaotic day a few blocks away from the NATO summit, where hundreds of protesters challenged a police line. Police in riot gear using their batons were able to push the protesters back, and eventually they dispersed. Ted Rowlands, CNN, Chicago.
I'm Paul Verkaman on the streets of Chicago. What I saw was about 1,800 to 2,200 protesters jam one intersection near the NATO summit. That's when police and riot gear tried to clear out the intersection. You could see that there was shoving going on. Cattle guards were being picked up. I saw about 8 people being treated in a makeshift triage unit. They said that they had been hit with batons, but I also saw a lot of shoving by the protesters, and police had been repeatedly taunted.
Ted Rowlands and Paul Verkaman both in Chicago for us tonight. Tomorrow's another day, and the NATO summit continues, and police expect crowds of demonstrators to fill the streets once again. Make sure you stay with CNN. We'll report it to you. We've been reporting on the protests happening in Chicago. They are happening again this evening. We'll get you some video now. These particular protesters are in front of an event that is being hosted by the First Lady of the United States, Michelle Obama. There's a dinner for NATO spouses at an art museum, and she is there at the Art Institute of Chicago. And these protesters are outside of that, protesting now, and we saw what happened on the streets. These don't appear, obviously, to be as violent as the ones that happened earlier, but we are keeping an eye on it. This is just into CNN from our affiliate WGN in Chicago. Again, we'll keep an eye on it for you. All right, live pictures now from Chicago, courtesy of our affiliate WGN. And obviously this cameraman does not realize he is on the air right now. But anyway, the protests, can we just come back to me on camera? This is probably dizzying our viewers right now. Thank you. The protests have been happening all over Chicago, specifically earlier in the South Loop, where they got really violent. That's the pictures that you're looking at. And we saw police officers pummeling some of the protesters there in Chicago, and we saw some of the protesters taunting police officers. This was 3 blocks away from the NATO summit that's happening there with the president and leaders from around the world. This evening, take a look at this. Let's show this video from earlier. This is the video of officers pummeling some of the protesters there earlier. Report this evening from WGN reporter Gaynor Hall found moments ago.
Where protesters, several groups of protesters have converged because this is where First Lady Michelle Obama was hosting a dinner for the first spouses of NATO officials. So it's been a spirited crowd gathering here just a few moments ago. They were jumping up and down, dancing in the streets, dancing in the rain. They weren't deterred by a brief downpour that we had, just as they weren't deterred earlier today by the extreme heat that descended on Chicago. So they are chanting, they are holding up their peace fingers. A few minutes ago, a group of them sat in the middle of Michigan Avenue forming a human peace sign, trying to send their message to the people who are inside the Art Institute. But so far, this leg of the protest, as far as we've seen, has been very peaceful. It was much like what we saw yesterday, where groups broke off from the larger protest earlier in the afternoon, and then they just started to march. They took to the streets once again, snaking around downtown Chicago and gathering here at Michigan. So that is the very latest from in front of the Art Institute. I'll send it back to you, Judy.
Okay, hard to hear that, reporter, but that was Gaynor Hall from WGN with all of the yelling and screaming there. And again, the protest continuing into the night in Chicago. It is just before 10 o'clock there, and it's going to continue on as I just wanted to check to see what else was happening on those pictures.